I'm Carole Bayer, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I've been in practice since 1990, so a very long time. And I work with families, I work with children, I work with at-risk children. I've worked in programs where children have been abused, where there's been domestic violence. I do some work currently as general therapist, working with all ages, but I also work a lot with high conflict families. And I get a fair amount of referrals from some wonderful attorneys that are present and some that are not in the room. Most of them are high conflict, and so it takes a little bit of strength and experience to understand and have a background and to work with these families. So I'm going to cover first domestic violence and the effects on children, and everybody should have their handout. Just a little basic information. Between 3 and 10 million children and adolescents witness violence between their parents or caregivers every year. We call this either domestic violence or intimate partner violence. The U.S. Department of Justice defines domestic violence as, quote, a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over the other intimate partner. It can be verbal, it can be physical, it can be sexual or psychological, and it's very often all of those. It can occur in all relationships, both heterosexual or with same-sex couples. Parents that are involved in a violent relationship may think that the fighting doesn't affect their children. And sometimes they'll say, well, the kids weren't in the room, but the children might have been in the closet, under the bed, shaking, frightened, or almost desensitized to it because at some point they know it's going to happen and they know where it's going to go, and they just don't even react at that point, although the feelings that they have are kept deep inside. One of the things that was brought up in quite a few articles is that children will most likely develop both behavioral and emotional side effects and behavioral problems because of the domestic violence in the home. We don't always see it. Sometimes when we look at these kids, especially middle school and high school aged, even sometimes elementary school aged, we may see acting out behavior, and someone will label them as ADHD immediately. They may be, but they also may not be. They may be responding to what they are going through at home. When there's domestic violence, or sometimes we just say DV between partners, there's very often child abuse as well. The child abuse can be just emotional, which is very powerful, so it's not a just, but there's also the very great likelihood that they are being hit or harmed as well in any kind of a DV situation. Kids need to be assessed for both their health and safety when there's domestic violence. So some of the symptoms to look out for. In young children, increased anxiety or fear, depression, loss of interest in school or friends or other activities that they had previously enjoyed, sleep problems or nightmares or bedwetting, increased aggression, anger, spending more time alone or isolating, fighting at home or at school, bullying or being bullied, and changes in appetite, changes in their sleep patterns. In adolescence, similar symptoms, but more access to drug or alcohol use as a way of coping. We'll add vaping into that as well. Skipping school, changing peer groups, rebellious or oppositional behavior, declining grades, social withdrawal, depression, anxiety, and again, loss of interest in their school friends and activities that they used to participate in, such as after-school sports or clubs that they used to belong to. Children and adolescents that are exposed to domestic violence should be evaluated by a trained therapist, a school counselor, or even a medical doctor for some of the problems that they may be hiding. It's important to remember that even the non-abusive parent, but the non-abusive parent needs support as well, as there's no typical victim. One of the things that we note, I don't have it in the handout, is that the victim, more often than not a woman, but can be a male as well, is that there's been a pattern of over-control for a very long time. And in this over control, did not include it, I should have. There's something called the power and control wheel out of the Duluth, Minnesota model. And it has 8 sections, and it talks about how the over control starts in a subtle way. It can be something like, well, what time are you finishing work tonight? Because I'll come pick you up. You don't need to take your car. Why did you take so long? If you finish work at 7 or 6, why are you now home 45 minutes later? Who are you talking to? I need to see your phone. And it starts in a way that's subtle. For some people, and I have lots and lots of women of all ages who find themselves in over-controlled relationships, and their response is, well, he loves me so much. And I have to help them see that part of loving someone is trusting them and giving them respect and freedom. And they don't see it because it feels they often come from situations in which they weren't loved very much. So all of a sudden, or if it's a second relationship following a violent relationship or an over-controlled relationship, they fall into it very easily. I have 3 women, and it turns out they all came on the same day about a week and a half ago, and I felt like I was giving a rote speech to all of them. I thought, well, in my little progress notes that I have to do later on, I'll just use the same template. All of them had been in violent relationships, and they finally got out, and guess what? They immediately have a new boyfriend who is so loving and caring and wants to control their life, but isn't violent yet, and may not be. Maybe the violence won't happen, but I don't think there's any of us that are intelligent, capable, and walking upright, male or female, that we want to be able to make our own decisions and make decisions. Whether we go back to school, whether we take a job, whether we don't feel like cooking that night, whether, heaven forbid, the bed is unmade that particular day. And yet these are the things that children will see in families. And I think, Sheila, you mentioned it, Carole, you did too, I think, that when children grow up in these families, they are learning the roles of how to be a husband and a wife, or a grown man or a grown woman. So if they see mom cowering, or if they see dad holding back because mom is overreacting and getting angry or throwing things, that's what they think is normal, because that's the family they grow up in. And so in a way, we almost have to reprogram them, although that sounds kind of extreme, but we have to help them see that that isn't love and that isn't healthy. And so when I tell these women, you get to say no. Yeah, but he'll be upset. What happens when he gets upset? Well, he doesn't hit me. Okay, but what does he do? Or what does she do? Well, she throws things at me. Or she says, I'm going to take the children. Or she won't speak to me for 3 days, or withhold sex. Okay. So all of this filters, it's not just the adults in the picture. All this filters down to the kids. And this is what they see. And guess what? When they go to school, we talked about bullying. They bully their friends. You have to do what I tell you to do. No, I don't. And I love working with young girls. I have a little girl who has some low cognitive functioning. She's in a regular classroom. And she grew up in a family in which there had been a lot of over-controlling behavior. She's about 8. And she proudly tells me that all the boys want to touch her and kiss her. And they tell her that she has to. She goes to a small private school. And of course, it may be made up. It's possible. Could be her fantasy. But I also said, you're the boss of your body. Do you want that to happen? And I also, we all have that little red flag that clicks on periodically. Then I start to think, okay, because she has some lowered cognitive ability, which is one of the risk factors for children to be abused or molested, what's happening at home? What's happening outside the home when other people come over? And so it's a new avenue for me. It wasn't the presenting problem. Her presenting problem was that she gets mad easily and doesn't know how to handle her frustration. And again, I know all of you and everybody watching this, you have that second sense, that gut feeling that says, these are things I need to look at. These are things I need to follow. So back to domestic violence. We know, again, it doesn't just affect the person who's victimized. It affects the kids. All of those symptoms, and maybe even some others, are very, very present, and it takes its toll. And these kids often grow up to replicate what they lived with, or what they lived when they were children. So,
and one comment on that, if I could.
of course.
And I saw that my comment that I'm about to make in one of my recent evaluations. We actually have to go back to the growing up of the parents, because what we see is the manifestation in that divorce situation. But you got to go back to them growing up, how they were with their parents, their educational background, their psychological background, because it really, and I'm learning that in all the years that I've done this work, that we really need to understand that parent. And so the last evaluation that we had, they did an in-depth analysis of both parents growing up and their dynamics in their families. And I think that's important because, as you said, then the parents have this behavior now that it gets folded into the child.
Right.
So it's this generational thing that just continues to happen until something
in our field there
changes.
Of course we learned all the various theories that are applicable, but I think for me the one that stands out the most, and it was my favorite one, was Bowen family therapy, and it was Murray Bowen, and he talked about generational family systems. And to piggyback on your comment, Sheila, what did that mom who is say victimized, or the dad who's victimized, what was their family growing up? Probably very, very similar. Where did their parents learn how to parent? And then when we talk about being able to address making changes and how valuable that is, and that we can make these changes that will not only impact these kids, but future generations as well. So,
Very important.
so that's just one section that I wanted to address. Yeah, any questions, any comments, any thoughts?
I'm sorry, I just have to tell you what I was telling Jennifer. It just made me laugh because my dad was so funny with my kids. And it just brought that memory back about the kids and my dad. It was, they had
And how
a
lucky.
great relationship.
How fortunate, how very, very fortunate. And those of us that did not grow up seeing violence or mean words or any hurtful behavior, how lucky we are. And I'm hopeful that that's everybody that we're addressing. But
I think, but to speak to that point, it's helpful when you've had some exposure. I didn't. I had a vanilla growing up with my mom and dad. But it's helpful because then we can kind of put ourselves in their positions and see that some of the behaviors that we thought were absolutely normal are not. Some of the things, you know, I see people whose base point is chaos because they grew up in chaos.
Yeah.
So if they're in a non-chaotic situation, they're uncomfortable. What do you mean we're not arguing and fighting and having all these things? Because that's their history and background. That sets the stage for their future.
I've had kids that will tell me that they go like going to their friends' houses, or they have a sleepover at their best friend's house, and they have said, "It's so calm. I love going there. They don't fight. They don't argue." And there's nothing these kids can do about it. And again, I talked about the fact that very often there is child abuse that goes along with it. Well, we share a case that is just ongoing, and we have new information about a dad who now, I learned, although he hates the ex-wife, and she's not too fond of him either, which is not unusual, but he's now taking a belt to the 14-year-old when the 14-year-old acts out. Well, the 14-year-old does act out, both behaviorally because I think what he's observed, and also this is a kid who does have ADHD, been diagnosed, he's getting treatment, and he has a really hard time. And being 14, male or female, is not an easy task anyway. He also has a slight speech impediment, which makes it even tougher for him because guess what? He gets teased and bullied at school, so he acts out. And I just learned this yesterday, and fortunately or unfortunately, a CPS report's going in today, as soon as I finish here, because the dad does not get to take a belt to his child. And we've talked about being patient. This dad, some time ago, had a major outburst, which is how they all got to us, to court, probably to the attorney, Ms. Adams, and probably to me. Thought he learned well, but his rationale that he says to the boy and the daughter, who's a little older, who does not get hit with a belt, she says, ever, is that, well, I'm allowed to hit with a belt as long as I don't leave a mark. But guess what mark he is leaving?
Mhm.
Right there. And the mark that he's leaving is for this boy who already has issues, who's a nice kid. Even if he wasn't a nice kid, he is, I'm not worth anything. If I make a mistake, I'm in danger. You're going to hurt me. And that's what intimate partners learn. If I don't do everything right,
Yeah.
you're going to hurt me. There was a book and then a movie, Prince of Tides. I don't know if some of you saw it. It was pretty riveting. But in one of the, oftentimes, and I think Conroy, I think, was the author, and he must have grown up in a family with violence because most of his books have a very violent dad. And it showed the three children terrified by this father. But the pivotal scene was because mother was always told what to do. It was very traditional, 1950s, 1960s, food on the table when I come home, exactly what I want. And so she made something, regular food, and he threw it on the floor, screaming at her. And of course, the children were cowering in fear that there wasn't enough meat on the plate. So mother goes in. This is in the movie anyway. I don't remember if it's in the book. She opens up a can of dog food.
Oh, dear.
And she heats it up in a pan, puts it on a plate. She brings it into him, says, "You want more meat? Here you go, honey." And he eats and he says, "Now this is good." And the children, the children were hiding their laughter. The movie was a lot more interesting than that and very, very deep. But yeah, it's such a pattern that keeps going on and on until someone stops it.
Do you think there is any valid place for corporal punishment with children?
Honestly, no. You are allowed, the law says, and I have a little presentation about child abuse reporting. Parents are allowed to spank their children.
Mm-hmm.
Basically open-handed, basically on the bottom, over their clothes. So the good thing that does, I suppose, is let the child know that when they do something wrong, there's a consequence. Do parents really want to hurt their child? And I often ask that. And I don't have perfect grown-up children, and I didn't have perfect children growing up, but we never hit them, because to me that's violence. And I was never hit growing up. I was an only child, so I was just a good little girl. Not always, but never got hit. I look at hitting as it's our power. Now, I know lots of people will disagree with me, and I will have adults that will say, "You know what, I would not have turned out okay if I wasn't spanked." But I think if a child goes and I think it's our reflexive action as a parent. So if you have a 3-year-old and they go near the stove and they go to put their hand on the stove, you can pull it back and say, "No, hot." If they do it again, parent might just reflexively smack their hand. Does it cause great pain? No. Is it an awareness that that's dangerous? So I think that's a question probably when parents ask me, I honestly just say that's up to you, but this is what the law is. If you leave a mark, now with CPS, and we'll get to CPS when I talk about that, you have to have a limb practically falling off. It has to be hanging by threads before CPS will get involved. And I know that doesn't sound very nice, but I've worked closely with them. I used to, when I first started in this field in 1990, I had a contract with CPS before they used Medi-Cal and IEHP and all of that. And I did all their reunification. And they'd send parents to me who had done some heinous things to their kids. And I would meet with them for a long period of time until then I would do a report based on whether it seemed as though they had changed their ways. So I think it's up to parents to make that decision. How useful is it? What do kids learn from being hit? I think one of the things as they get older, certainly not at 14, is to fear the parent. Now this 14-year-old boy, when I asked him, at first he said, "No, that doesn't happen." And his sister was in the room, and she said, "Yeah," and I won't say his name, but yeah, it does. I said, "Does it happen to you too?" She said, "No." Because he does push buttons, and it's true, he does. He's not an easy child. Mom raises her voice. Does mom ever hit? No. Mom just takes away his electronics. He'd rather be hit than have his computer taken, which is very typical. So I could call Dad and talk with him, but my obligation legally, and again I'll get to that after a while, as a mandated reporter, is I have to make the report. My only worry, 2 worries. One, we all know where this is going to go.
Mhm.
Next week, this boy is back with Dad.
Yeah.
I'm making the report today. I'm going to tell them will it go down to all the different levels? You need to interview this child only at school, and he's probably going to deny it because he is afraid of that parent. He doesn't want that parent to be mad at him. He probably will say, no, that doesn't happen. Okay, I still have to do the report no matter what the outcome. And so if he says that, guess what CPS is going to do? Inconclusive. I understand that. They only know what they know.
Right.
They're not going to break down the door and walk into the house and say, are you sure you're not being abused? They're not going to say, lower your pants to a 14-year-old boy and let me see if you're being hit. He's being hit with a belt. Now, hopefully they'll interview the sister too. But then they're going to go talk to Dad.
Yep.
And he's going to be frustrated. And he's going to say, why are you telling these things? You know I love you. Here, I'll buy you tickets to the hockey game. I'll buy you whatever you want.
And Carol, that happened in one of the cases we were on because the kids were afraid. I was
Sure.
convinced the violence was happening by Mom. And 4 or 5 or 6 CPS reports later, and I know a lot about CPS because my sister worked for the department in Los Angeles for 35 years until she retired. And it's rare that they do anything unless there's some serious physical manifestations, blood, anything like that. They may take a week or 2 or 3 to investigate and nothing generally happens. When I had, in my private practice, I would go into court on an ex parte if I would see those kinds of things because that's the scary part for the kid. To have to go back into that household
Right.
after turning the dad in and then nothing happens. What do you do?
Yeah.
Right? And as minors counsel, I mean, we have the right to file requests for orders and do those kinds of things. And I wouldn't hesitate to do it personally. The one case that we had, that was my initial thought, and fortunately both lawyers agreed to my recommendations, and I said, you can go to court and ex parte and tell the judge a kid should be back with you, and I'm going to be right over there telling the judge why not. So pick your poisons, I really don't care, and nobody ever did an ex parte. But that's one option because we know CPS is probably not going to do anything.
And I don't fully fault the
that's it.
social workers per se. I mean, they have their standards, they have their
Yeah.
rules and their regulations of what they have to do and the way they see abuse, but they're not involved long enough. They're probably
Exactly.
very short-staffed. So it's not like I bash them, but every time I do a report, I know unless there are major handprints on that child's back, or I mean, when I used to work with the at-risk kids that were in rich foster care. That was my job when I worked for mental health, really my first position. And I'd go in and I'd see these kids that had been horribly abused. I had a little girl who had bite marks all over her back. And guess what? There were about 7 reports made before they finally took it seriously. They said it was self-inflicted. Now you tell me how a child takes off their head, turns it around, bites their back, right? And it's a true case. I don't know. I mean, it's been years and years. This child's probably, certainly an adult by now. I think that the common denominator for all of us that work with these families is we advocate for kids. So when a parent calls, and I'm sure that all of you get it too. I get these emails and these text messages. You're not listening. You're taking Dad's side. You're taking Mom's side. You know, you're a horrible person. And I think we've all probably had that. I know I'm not a horrible person. I know I advocate for kids, and at 76 years of age, I will continue to until I retire, and then I'll still continue in some fashion. And so it's like, bring it on.
Indeed.
So yeah, I think we all do that. So.
And these are passionate things because we know the ultimate outcomes. We know as minors counsel, we touch a fraction of the issues in family law cases because there aren't a bunch of us here. And there are so many families that there has been 0 intervention. And I think about these kids and how they turn out.
Yeah.
Because either the court doesn't appoint minors counsel, maybe they're not in the legal system, they accept the violence and it continues on. But it's the outcome for that child that causes me to have so much passion about this work. Because I know what we're doing to the kid. The adults are going to do what they do. But those kids are going to be damaged and scarred for the rest of their lives. How unfortunate.
And then at some point, not that we really need it, because I think our egos are intact, and I'm thinking of the case that you spoke about with the 3 little boys, that they will come in and speak so highly of you and of you, Carole, and thank us for the work thank us for caring and for loving them in our way of loving them, which is showing protective care. And so we don't get that a lot probably, but when you do see that, or years later, and I like everybody, I have forgotten who these people are, but they'll say, "Do you remember me? You helped me, you made a difference, or you were pivotal in getting me out of that relationship." I don't really need that. It's nice to hear. It's more valuable because the person really has done it themselves. And I'm sure that you all do the same. I put it back on them. You did the hard work. I gave you some tools, but you did the work. And that takes real strength. Yes, ma'am.
I, as minors counsel, represented 3 kids, and it ultimately came out that they were being horribly abused by their dad. They're adults now, and I am their guardian angel on Facebook.
Isn't that nice?
They're all in contact
Yeah.
with me, and they still tell me how much they love me as their guardian angel. It is a very rewarding job.
We don't get it enough, and we probably don't really need it that much, but it is nice to hear because it balances the negativity. And there's not all that much negativity, but
No, I think it helps. I think it's good.
Yeah.
You know, when you get that positive feedback,
Mhm.
because we know that if people don't feel protected, and many of these kids do not, then how do
Beautiful.
they respond to that? The bad outcomes that Wallerstein and all of the other psychologists 30
Yeah.
years ago talked
Yeah.
about, and these kids turn out to be damaged goods, and they go into the next marriage and into the grandkids and into the subsequent relationships with all the same patterns, and it's so sad. It's the kids.
I keep this on my computer monitor. For Carole, thank you for helping this kid. You were a great part of his success, and he's now a Marine.
Oh,
But I
Nice.
keep
gives me
his-
chills. Isn't that nice?
Yeah.
Nice.
That's wonderful.
Very nice.
Yeah.
I think it's better for a child to grow up in a single-family household than a mildly abusive household.
Say again. I'm sorry.
Do you think
What?
there's comparatively in terms of bad outcomes of single-parent households versus where there's fighting that goes on, arguing? I mean, that question is of where to draw the line between we should separate because we argue, and versus parents that stay together and argue.
I can't tell you how many kids I've had of all different ages, even young ones, and especially through play therapy and drawing, and I do a lot of sand tray work and storytelling with all kinds of, I have hundreds of little miniatures, little items that they can use to tell stories. Almost all of them, when we talk about how mom and dad fight, guess what they say? I wish they'd get a divorce.
Mhm.
Because they don't want the fighting. They, excuse me, they cower when they see mom and dad together. Now, not all kids, and in some there's tension, and it's sporadic and it's not constant. So I guess, and again, I'm not the queen of the world. I wish I were sometimes. Don't we all? But I think in a healthy single parent situation, and if the children don't have too much contact, or even if mom and dad separate and they're both okay on their own, because you've now taken away the gasoline to pour on the fire. Now, they're going to get into other relationships and continue the passivity or the aggression, but it's healthier at that point for the kids because they don't have to see the fighting. And so when they come home and they know that it's safe, their shoulders go down.
Right.
They can breathe. When they don't have to worry about walking on eggshells. And I often ask kids, depending on their age, of course, because I work with kids from as young as actually 3.5, as long as they're verbal and we can have some dialogue or some kind of expression of feelings. But especially with school-age kids and middle school kids, they know what walking on eggshells is. And if they don't, I sort of explain it to them. And they are so afraid, not that they are going to be hurt so much, they are afraid that if something happens and they do the wrong thing, mom or dad's going to start to fight. And then that's where I've had kids say, you know what, I've asked them, what do you do when mom and dad argue? I've had kids, multiple kids say, I hide under my bed. They can only do that for so long. I go in my closet. I shut my door. Now I put in my earbuds. I put on my earphones. And some of the kids will then say to me that are older and have access, that's when I go outside and I start smoking weed. That's when I grab the vodka that's in the freezer or wherever people put their vodka.
Yeah.
And so their coping mechanism is escape, either physical escape or emotional escape.
What are the consequences of that escapism I mean, just the psychological side
Oh,
of it.
I think what you learn growing up in a family is what you carry with you. So if you've learned that the wall can go up and you can push people away, or that fighting is the way to respond, or if I'm mad at you and that pen is sitting right here and I throw that pen at you, even though it might not hurt you, it might not. What I've now learned is that's how you deal with relationships. So the family systems approach, which started with Bowen and Mnuchin and all of these other wonderful theorists, presented that what we learn growing up in our family is what we carry with us. So hopefully all of us, Sheila, it sounds like you did, Carole, it sounds like you did too, I know I did. My parents probably argued, I'm sure they did,
Sure.
but I never heard curse words. I'm sure I heard it at school, of course, but never heard it at home. No, there was no name calling. And guess what? In my family, my husband and I disagree. Not as much, we're old now, so we don't disagree too much anymore. But when we were younger, sure we did, over parenting, over this, that. And he never called me a curse word. Now, he may have thought it, and I've probably thought it too, but it never came out because I didn't grow up with that, and he didn't either, although his parents argued a lot. They're European, it was a whole different dynamic, very paternal, patriarchal, but no curse words. Not that we could hear. We never throw anything. Are we perfect? No, of course not. But you learn, and hopefully my adult children, who are not married, and I wish they were, so if anyone knows anybody, being the Jewish mother that I am, but growing up in that kind of family, you live what you learn. There was that I think back in the 60s it was real popular. It was a framed statement of children learn what they live, and it went through all these different kinds. If they learn to do this, then they're going to do that. And it's true. It's true. We can't make a perfect family, but we can intervene and hopefully be the voice of reason as often as possible if the parents allow us to. And to go backwards a little bit onto your parental alienation, that gets in the way. Because when a parent thinks that the other parent is just horrible, male or female, or even in a same-sex relationship, that parent is bad. Those children now learn access to that parent is off limits, and they now believe the alienating parent, oh yeah, he's bad. He's a terrible person. He doesn't let me do A, B, and C.
Do kids grow out of that though? I mean, if turning 25, I mean, maybe you lose contact with them. You don't get to see it yourself too
You're
often.
right.
But I mean, is there a point when a child has been highly alienated and there's not much to be do except to work through that reunification, and even it doesn't happen by the time they're 16, 17, 18, but then they go out in the world, they go to college, they separate maybe from that alienated parent for a time. Do you see kids that have been alienated reunify in their 20s and their 30s and their 40s? Is it more likely? Is it something we can bank on? Like if I'm representing a client, say, you got to just let go, unfortunately. We've tried, we've spent 2 years trying to do reunification, it's not working. Just circle back when she's 25, circle back when she's 30. You know?
It's a good question, and I don't think I have an answer for you, only because you're right, we sort of don't follow them at that point. And the damage that's been done by the alienating parent is so solid that the adult child now may have contact, and I have a few people that do have contact with that parent, but it's minimal because they've lost so much time. Is it repairable? Yes. Does everybody need therapy? No. A lot of people do. But even then, I do have a couple of clients that have reconnected with that parent, and it wasn't so much the alienation, it was that parent left the home and they said they started up a new family. And so the anger and the hurt is there until they maybe look at the whole picture, and maybe the whole picture is that parent really did leave. Maybe there was no abuse, maybe that parent left and couldn't stand being in that family, or couldn't stand being with that other parent, and now they have a whole new family. And so the damage is, I think, a feeling of abandonment. And abandonment is powerful, and what we also know, and it's not that every single person that goes through a situation like that will have this, but abandonment is one of the precursors to borderline personality disorder. And that is a personality style that is so damaging, and it comes out of fear of being abandoned and not cared about. Now, does every child who grows up in a family where mom or dad is left have that? No, they don't. There's probably a lot of factors. So is it repairable? I think it's tough. I really think it's tough. And it's not the fault of the child, but the child feels that they did something wrong. Or they have this false belief that that parent is so terrible.
I have found in maybe 2 or 3 cases over a long period of time where there was significant, I don't want to use the word alienation because I don't know that that was the cause, because the one parent who was the out parent actually did stuff to make them make themselves the out parent. Spray painted dad's, it was the mom, spray painted dad's locks, and I mean did all kind of crazy stuff to dad, and the kids all knew about it. So the kids really had, I mean, put glue in his locks at home and did all kinds of crazy stuff. Chased him with the car, tried to run down a kid and the dad through a parking lot. We're talking pretty bad behavior on the part of mom. So the kids did not have any contact with her much through their teenage years while dad had custody. And like I said, there were some pretty good reasons, but now that they're adults, they do have contact with mom. And I think they have happy, good contact with her because there's no conflict between mom and dad anymore. You know, there's no custody war anymore. There's none of that. And I have another case that was about 5 years ago where dad was such an over-controlling person. Oh, this is in front of Commissioner McCoy. That even though mom had custody and dad had weekends, he would not leave that kid alone about, you have got to get out of mom's house. You have got to get out of mom's house. I mean, one of the most controlling people I've ever seen in my career, ever. He ultimately ended up, the child ultimately ended up with dad when he was about 16 because dad wrote up this report, this is what you were going to say. Stepdad did this to me, stepdad did this to me, stepdad did this to me. Kid just turned 18, is going into the Marines, I believe. He came to visit mom, and I got a picture, text message last week where he's hugging his stepdad, hugging his mom, hugging his little sisters. So yes, sometimes kids are gone out of a parent's life. Maybe not by choice, sometimes by choice. It can be both ways. It can be that the parent who lost custody actually did stuff. But when kids grow up and they learn whatever it is to forgive mom who was chasing them through the parking lot with a car, you know, they grew up and they begin to understand and they can forgive some stuff, and you know, through counseling of their own, which I know these boys had, things can be repaired. And no matter how awful they seem to be, I never in a million years thought those boys would ever have a relationship with their mom, and they do. And I think that, you know, therapy as a young adult really is helpful. Because as a kid, they're still in the middle of 2 parents who are fighting. But when they're young adults and they're out and ready to learn and grow, I think a lot of things can be repaired that we never thought could be.
It would be interesting, and that's something maybe I'll kind of try to dig up maybe for the next time around, but I don't know the research on the outcomes. Because again, we in my profession, we generally see people for this amount of time. Sometimes they come back a few years later, but once the children have sort of launched and they've gone off to college or gone off to work or gone to the military or moved away, oftentimes they don't stay in contact with us. And understandably so. We're here for just a short period of time. So it would be interesting to find out. I don't really know for sure.
One of the 3 articles that I gave you guys on parental alienation actually discusses it, not in great detail, but basically it talks about as children get older and turn 18 and move away from their parents, they get to see the other side of this bad parent when they're not under the control of the mom who has alienated them, and get to see a different person. But all of these kids are damaged to some degree, you know, some more than less, I think some intervention is important, but once kids grow up and they start their journey in life, they get to look back and they see, oh, that was happening when I was a kid growing up. And it could take months, years, decades, sometimes never. But kids are truly affected by it.
Yeah.
And the parents just don't see how much that impacts their adult life, because then they grow up and they have kids and they're abusive to their kids or they're controlling to their spouses. And then that same pattern continues to perpetrate itself until somebody gets intervention. I'm convinced that intervention is necessary. It's like if you have cancer, you just can't do it on your own. Well, I'm gonna pray on it, and I'm gonna do some meditation. I mean, there's certain things that you have to have some level of intervention so that you can understand the dynamics and how you operate, so that you can then see more clearly. But I think there's a good chance of good outcomes when kids do grow up, if it's not the extreme cases. The extreme cases are terrible, because that child will never ever believe anything good about the parent who they believed was the bad parent, the abuser.
If you would like, I can segue into child abuse reporting, or you want?
Go right ahead. You're talking about domestic violence right now. I think that's great.
Okay, so one of the questions often that comes up in terms of child abuse, I have some handouts for you folks, for child abuse reporting is, do we report domestic violence? And yes and no. Our law says, for therapists, that if children are not in the home at all, if a woman comes to me and she's, my husband, or a man comes to me and says my wife or partner is hurting me, we do not report that, strangely enough, because of confidentiality. We can actually lose our license for breaking confidentiality. We can strongly, and believe me how strong I can be, even though I don't look like I am, when I have a person who's sitting across from me and I say, is that okay? How do you feel about that? Do you deserve that? Is that how your mom was treated? Is that how, if you had a child, you would allow your daughter to be treated or your son to be treated? But we don't make that report. Now, here's the caveat. If there's children in the home, even if at that very moment they are not in the household, and this is going to be covered a little bit in, I think, in my child abuse reporting, we can then report. And actually, we have the option. Sometimes it changes, but we certainly can then report, and I do. Because if there's violence in the home towards an intimate partner, guess what? There's most likely violence towards the children, or, again, we file it if there's no physical violence. If the child says, no, my mom or my dad doesn't ever hit me, or they don't throw things, and the book that they threw barely missed my head because I moved away. It's emotional abuse, and so we generally file it on the CPS reporting form. I don't know if you folks file very often. I file often. I think I know all of the people in Moreno Valley. And do I file because I want to? No, I don't want to. Sometimes I'm on the phone for 45 minutes waiting to get the report in. And so it's my time. Do I get reimbursed for it? Of course not. Is it about money? No, but it's still my time. But it's frustrating, because I also know that this long report that I just filled out in writing, and now I have to call in, and then I have to either fax or mail it within 36 hours, is probably going to just be, unfounded. And again, I don't fault everybody there. By the time they get out in an interview, no. So, but we do as therapists, I don't know if in your profession as attorneys, as therapists, we do have to report. Or
We don't.
We're not
We're not
mandatory.
mandated.
No?
We're not.
Okay, lucky.
You are.
Oh, yeah. So, I have some handouts for everybody.
By the way, I think it's a crime for you not to.
It is? Oh, yeah, you know what the crime is? Now, I don't think it's changed, but we can lose our license, one. We can, if that doesn't, thank you, Sheila,
Yes.
thanks. We can go to jail. I've never heard of anybody where that happens, but I suppose if you blatantly ignore what you're being told, we can be fined. We could probably be sued.
Yep.
So, okay, so the reporting law, interestingly, I'm going to ask a question. This is a test question. Roughly when do you think the child abuse and reporting law came into being? At what point?
You mean year or?
Year.
Oh,
Yeah. Well, you cheated,
I
Sheila.
cheated
You
too.
look,
Well,
that's right.
Michael. You cheat. Well, you weren't
I
supposed
just-
to read it yet.
Okay, I just saw it from 1963. I
Yes.
was 11.
I know.
I remember that.
You don't get to cheat on my tests.
Sorry.
I know I was a mandatory reporter when I was a dental hygienist.
That's right. That's right.
So
Yeah.
that was in the early 60s.
Do you know that
late 60s.
When I taught at COD, I've taught at a few different places out here, and I've always enjoyed it. But when I taught child abuse and neglect at COD, I got a lot of information. And one of the things that students couldn't believe, that there were reporting requirements for animal abuse well before there were reporting requirements for children.
Wow.
So that's something to think about. So, all right, since Sheila already knows, so the first child abuse reporting law came about in 1963, but it was only for physicians. Also, don't forget, back at that time, therapy wasn't so popular. Yeah, we had Freud and we had Adler and we had a lot of the other big names in therapy, but it was different. It wasn't involving the family very much. What it involved was one individual coming in, lying on a couch, paying whatever they paid, 4 days a week, having intense psychotherapy. I don't think there's anyone that does that anymore. I would imagine not. And then around, probably in conjunction with the reporting requirements and why, and they coalesced, was family systems theory came into being around the 1960s. Sorry, wonderful allergies out here. It came into being, which then meant that Michael, if you're a 4-year-old and you come to my office and mom and dad say, well, Michael seems sad or he's having a hard time, I don't just work with Michael. Even if you were 12 years old, I want to meet mom and dad or whoever is raising you, if it's grandparents. I want to learn more about the family. I actually would want to see the family in action and how they function, because boy, does that tell me a lot. And so right around the 1960s is when this whole family systems approach blossomed. Did that impact reporting for therapists? Maybe, because therapy wasn't so popular. What did people back in the 50s and 60s think about therapy? You have to be, I'm going to use a word, I hate the word, you have to be crazy to go to a therapist, right? And it's offensive. And no, you have to be human. But it wasn't popular. It took a long time. And even now, even though we are so evolved, there's still a lot of families that look at it as there's something really, really wrong with you. And there's a whole cultural piece. Many different cultural groups, not just one or two, many cultural groups see it as, we don't go and tell people our private information. So in the beginning, only doctors were mandated reporters. They had to report basically only physical abuse. So if a child came in and had big gashes on their arms or redness on their bottom, or I don't even think they talked much about sexual abuse, because remember, it was the 1950s and the 60s. We were watching, Father Knows Best. We were watching all those shows where women wore, pretty little dresses while they were cooking.
Leave It to Beaver.
Leave It to Beaver. All of those
Still
shows.
comes on today, but
I imagine it does. So that, they didn't look at that. We didn't think of that. So anyway, only physicians reported physical abuse. As people began to understand child abuse, and the knowledge increased over time, it then became apparent that other professionals might have access to these kids and became mandated reporters. And I did not put, and I apologize, I can copy it, or maybe Carole, we can do that. Who reports? I'm just going to give you a quick list. Clergy members, any child care provider, someone who runs a day camp, an administrator or an employee of a public or private youth center. And I will, we can copy this particular handout, I think it's helpful. Anyone who does an after-school program. Any employee or administrator or a licensee of a community care or child daycare facility. Excuse me, an employee of a child care institution. Foster parents have to report. Group home personnel. Residential care facilities. Educators, teachers, instructional aides, teachers' aides. Any classified employee that has knowledge of, because they often don't have, some of the administrators don't have direct access to the kids, but anyone in the school district that has knowledge of or is told of abuse is a mandated reporter. Of course, law enforcement, sheriff's department, probation department, county welfare department, peace officers, firefighters. This is interesting, except for volunteer firefighters. They're not mandated reporters. Animal control officers. Guess what happens if you go out and does abuse stop only with people? No. No. We have a neighbor, I'm diverting her. We have a neighbor who we just waved to. And his marriage ended, we've been in that house for a really long time, so maybe 15 years ago. And I didn't know them very well. She sort of left in the dark of the night, took the kids and never came back. But I'm not their therapist. I know my boundaries. And, we would wave and just, hi, how are you? So he was there by himself. Well, recently I learned, because he has 2 mammoth dogs that are pretty aggressive. And something happened. A neighbor was walking their little puffy, fluffy dog. And I'm hearing, I didn't see this part. I'm ready to go to work and I'm hearing screaming. I open up the garage. His 2 dogs, one's a Rottweiler, the other's I think a pit bull. It's not necessarily, I believe, the breed, it's the way they're treated. We're running after and grabbing this dog, and this poor little woman, probably half the size of me, was screaming. And so I ran out there and I grabbed a broom, and fortunately he, the neighbor across the way, who has the owner of the dogs, came running out. He said, they're not dangerous, while the one had this little teeny puffy dog in his mouth, in the scruff of his neck. Fortunately, amazingly enough, the dog was okay. The woman was so shaken, she was absolutely shaking. So I brought her into the garage. I said, let me close the door. And I said, let's check the dog. The dog had a little bite. And I said, you might want to go to the vet. You might also want to file a police report, because this is really unacceptable. Okay, fast forward to the next day. And we're not gossipy people. None of us are, I think. But the neighbor next door had heard what happened. And he said, well, you don't know what so-and-so does. I said, what does he do? He said, well, you know why his wife left in the first place. I said, no, I really didn't know them very well. And he was very abusive. So he knows the work I do. I mean, this was 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And he said, but he also beats his dogs because they will learn how to respond to his commands. So I said, I don't want to start up a whole thing in our neighborhood. And he's a little bit of a scary guy. He's also an ex-police officer. Now, I am in no way saying that that's why. I have great respect for law enforcement, very much so. But he used his power in an inappropriate, he's retired now, fortunately. Anyways, one of the neighbors said they were going to call animal control, and I was kind of glad. So anyway, it extends to animal abuse too. So any law enforcement, any animal control officers, medical professionals, nurses, paramedics, EMT, physicians, dentists, chiropractors, anyone that works in a medical or dental office. Obviously, mental health professionals, social workers, trainees, and interns, MFTs like me, school counselors, psychologists, and commercial film and photographic print processors. And why do you think that is?
You see the photos.
Yeah, of course, nowadays, probably that job is non-existent, except maybe for wedding pictures, I don't know. So let me run through a little.
Is that going to be based on personal knowledge, like or could it be here? I guess I'm looking at more from the lawyer's side, the hearsay, like your intake person, your receptionist, there's something said to them, or they observe something, they tell you, and that triggers your obligation?
I think so, yeah, I would say, I mean, if you're not a mandated reporter, then it's kind of
even if you're getting secondary information.
Well, I would follow it through, because I know enough that we can't always, there's always 2 sides to a situation. So there could be a parent saying, now you go in and you tell them that dad beats you up, and it doesn't happen. So I think it requires further investigation.
Well, and then maybe that would be the perfect example. One parent tells you that this is happening, but the child doesn't confirm it. Is that a situation where you report?
That's a good iffy. That's an iffy. There's a red flag, because I've been told this, but now do I act on it? Like the case I talked about before. Well, the one girl said, the one child said, I see it happening. And he takes him out to the garage and he'll take out the belt. And then finally the other child said, yeah, that happens, but I deserve it. I said, no, you don't. You do have to act appropriately. You do have to behave. You do have to listen to your parent.
So dig a little bit is the
Yeah,
answer.
yeah, I think you have to dig if you can.
So I'm not a mandated reporter, but I see something. I was in my neighborhood one day, a quiet neighborhood in Palm Springs. It was the dead of summer, and it was 110, 15 degrees. And there was this guy with an infant child walking down the street in the middle of the day,
In the heat.
in the heat. I saw a mom one day at the high school. I'm a runner, and I did run marathons. And she had her 3-year-old kid. She was walking with a friend, and they were walking very fast, and the kid was trying to run to catch up to him. And in both instances, I called the Palm Springs Police Department. I went, really?
Mm.
Where's the mom over here? And here's the mom with her friend just yakking away, going
Yeah.
around the track. It's in the morning time.
Yeah.
But here's this little kid trying to catch up with them. And she's a little bit, could have been more than 3 years old. I just called the cops in both.
Yeah.
I mean, I know I'm not a mandated reporter, but I can't stand looking at that.
Well,
stuff.
we're only
Wow.
mandated reporters are only mandated to report if they are providing some kind of care to the person. So and this happened once, I won't go to the story because we probably don't have time, but if I'm in a market and I see a parent grab a kid really harshly and slam them down into the basket, which I saw, I am not obligated by any professional means to make that report because I don't know them. I don't have any information on them. But you did the right thing. What we should do is go up to the supermarket manager and say, could you please call 911? Of course, now we all have cell phones, but this was back in the day that we didn't. Can you call 911 because there's a parent being very, very aggressive and rough with their child? Now, by the time the police come, that parent may be out of there. We can't do it for everybody, but we have a sort of a moral obligation. And
Well, and there's a potential liability. I mean, somebody could sue me and say, how dare you, but, you know.
I don't think,
My life isn't about that, so sue me.
yeah, and I think for mandated reporters, we are protected against being sued, getting into trouble, having our license taken. In fact, so we have a lot of protections. As a human being and as a public person, I think it would be very tough for anyone to sue. I really do, and I don't know if it's ever happened. But let me run through real quickly. Just you have 2 pages. I'm going to go to some of it's really yucky stuff to hear, but so we have physical. I'm going to run through the categories very quickly. Physical abuse. We have child sexual abuse, willful cruelty and unjustified punishment, unlawful corporal punishment, neglect, general neglect, and severe neglect. Just as a highlight for you to know, you probably already know this, when you have drug abusing parents, you often have the likelihood of sexual abuse to the young children because people are in and out of the home. Parents are too wigged out to know what's going on. And you're going to wind up seeing a lot more neglect. Toilets that don't work, refrigerators with no food or rotten food, feces on the floor. I won't even begin. I was in a program with mental health and then in a different agency that we got CPS reports that were closed, but they wanted to still provide services. I remember I had to use the bathroom, which you should never do in a house where you're going in and there's general neglect, but I didn't have a choice because it was summer and I had too much liquid. And I looked down, okay, this will be one of those, ooh. And the carpet was moving. It was like a little throw carpet, and I went, of course, my response I will not say what I said. It wasn't nice, but it was like, oh my, magnified. And guess what I saw coming out from under the rug? Cockroaches. And so, yes, I never used their bathroom again. I got out of there as quickly as I could, but guess who was still living there? Those children.
Yeah.
In the filth. So the handout, it goes into what physical abuse is, what sexual abuse is, and for sexual abuse, it's not just direct touching or abusing or raping or having sex with a minor child, or the child minor and non-consensual, of course, but it is exposing them to pornography, exposing them to yourself, even when you talked about the case, with the dad showing his boy how to urinate and then shake. That's not sexual abuse, but anything that happens to a child that is inappropriate. I have a line that I use with kids a lot, and I say, "You're the boss of your body," and I think I mentioned that with the little girl. You are in charge. If someone touches you or not, you get to say, "What? No, don't," and then you tell. So, any questions? Anything?
Awesome.
I'm going to let you look at this is hopefully helpful and valuable for you.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.